Hello, Chair Lockwood.
Hi, good to see you. Well, I think we have a quorum, and so when we hit 1:30, I'll go ahead and start.
Chair Lockwood, there's a portion of the meeting, if we go long, that I will have to be off of video.
At 3 o'clock or so? Okay.
That's it.
Okay. Thanks for letting us know.
Mm-hmm.
I might as well chime in as well. I will be able to be on until 3 as well, and
Okay.
will have to quit at that time due to a meeting conflict, work conflict that I can't rearrange or couldn't rearrange. And it's actually in Salem, and I'm in Beaverton today right now, and so I'll actually be participating as I commute to Salem, beginning at like 2 something. So
Okay.
I will still be participating, but it will be probably without the video.
Okay. Thanks for telling us. All right. Since we have a quorum, I think we'll go ahead. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Lockwood, Chair of the Washington County Planning Commission. Today is February 2nd, 2022, and today's meeting of the Planning Commission is called to order. Well, I'd like to start today by introducing our newest member, Morgan Will, who's joining us today, his first meeting. And I'd like for him to say a little bit about himself, to introduce himself, and then have the rest of us introduce ourselves to him. So would you go ahead, please, Morgan?
Yes, thank you, Chair Lockwood, and hello, fellow commissioners and viewers. My name is Morgan Will, and I'm excited to be on the Planning Commission. I went to elementary school in Washington County in the Shoals Ferry Road area, and I went away for middle and high school and college, and I moved back here with my family about 15 years now in Washington County, and I'm excited to be a part of this community and help it grow. And obviously it's my first position on the Planning Commission, and I look forward to working with you all on projects. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. We're glad to have you. Again, I'm Deborah Lockwood, serving as chair, and I am representing Commissioner Treese's district, District 2, and I live in the Helvetia area, about a mile from the urban growth boundary, and I'm in my second term now on the Planning Commission, and I try to bring perspective on the rural-urban interface and also on rural issues. Who'd like to be next?
I will go next. It is very good to have this seat filled. So welcome, and so glad to have you. My name is Blake Dye. I represent District 3. I am in the Garden Home, Raleigh Hills area. So you had some life experiences over here, which is great. And I previously was on ERMDAC, and very much into bike, pedestrian, safe passage issues, as well as what we can do to improve our area that's adjacent to Multnomah County. So looking forward to working with you.
Who'd like to be next?
Go ahead, Mr. Chair. Morgan and I actually know each other. We've kind of worked in the same capacity for a long time here locally. We know a lot of the same people. We recently got the opportunity to meet, but excited to have somebody with the extensive knowledge you have of not only our business, but also the county's code. So welcome.
Jeff, or Commissioner Petrillo.
Yes, hi. Morgan, my name's Jeff Petrillo. I've been on about as long as Commissioner Wellner has, which is probably the longest of any of the other appointed members. And I represent, I'm in the Bethany area and appointed by the commissioner of that area, and have enjoyed serving. And I've heard good things about you from Matt and from others, so we welcome you. I assume from what Matt's saying and has shared that you're in the real estate or real estate development side of the business, and code development code knowledge is something few of us have mastered, so we do welcome that additional knowledge.
Thanks, Jeff. If I may add, I forgot, Chair Lockwood, just to mention that, yeah, I do have a master's in urban regional planning from Portland State, and worked as a consultant in the planning world and development manager for projects. And so I'm happy and excited also to bring that knowledge to the commission and support the county in looking at state goals and county goals. And so, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of a planner on the planning commission.
Yes.
That's something we should have, but we don't, except for Matt's experience. So, welcome.
How about Commissioner Havener?
Good afternoon, Morgan. Mark Havener, I represent District 3. I live in the Progress Ridge area, actually. I border Washington County and Tigard. Unfortunately, I'm in Washington County. And I bring 33 years of public safety experience to the Planning Commission. I spent those years in the fire service, most recently retiring from 12th Valley Fire and Rescue in September. And as my friends would say, retirement doesn't suck. So having fun. Thank you.
Commissioner Bidu.
Good afternoon. I am Rachel Mori Bidu, and I represent District 1, which is Beaverton. I live in central Beaverton, and my background is in affordable housing, and currently work in affordable housing finance, and I'm really looking forward to working with you.
And Commissioner Milliman.
Hi, Morgan. I'm Stacy Milliman. I also represent District 1 and live in the Aloha area, like 165th and Rigert. And yeah, I don't have much background in city planning, but I do business analysis for a living and wanted to be involved in the community. So looking forward to working with you.
Excuse me, Chair Lockwood, I should mention, along the same lines, Morgan, I work in and have worked real estate, but primarily affordable housing, tax credit projects in Portland, and know Commissioner Bidu from her work, and we work together. But so that's my background. I've also done real estate work and consulting on my own, and as investment, but sort of a broad experience in those areas.
Well, again, welcome.
Chair Lockwood, since everyone's talking about the real estate experience, I just want to add that I also bring very good knowledge of using Zillow and Redfin. So I know how to use those apps, and I look at what housing prices are, and I get astonished, and I spend my free time.
All right. Well, welcome, Commissioner Will. So let's go ahead to our director's report.
That would be me. So thank you. So first I want to introduce, you see different people on the screen. So Rob Bovet is a new county council person who's been hired to replace Jacqueline, but to do the same job that Jacqueline has been doing. And so they're kind of transitioning. But Rob, why don't you just say a few words about your past and what you're doing now?
Great, thanks. Yeah, my name is Rob Bovet. I'm actually not replacing Jackie. She's handing off some land use stuff to me and a variety of things and taking on other things. So I have been a county lawyer for about 30 years, initially with Lincoln County. I was a generalist there. I'm a generalist here at Washington County. So I've done some land use in Lincoln County. I did pretty much all the code enforcement there for about 16 years as well. And then I was with the Association of Oregon Counties, where I lobbied in a lot of different portfolios, including land use. So I'm glad to be here. I've been with Washington County for, I think, a whopping 2 weeks. And even though I know something about land use and land use planning and Senate Bill 100 and DLCD and LUBA, and I've done all that stuff, it's a steep learning curve, learning the Washington County Planning Code and the way you guys do things. So I'm still in the steep learning curve stage of uptake. So I'll be monitoring today. I don't know that I'll have anything to add or contribute, but thank you for allowing me to be here.
Yeah, welcome.
Chair Lockwood, if I might.
Sure.
And I just wanted to just offer to the group, I'm here because Alan is out in Washington skiing. So he asked me to cover for him. But for that trip, Alan would be here. So, but it's good to see everybody. It's really nice to see everybody here today.
Good to see you too.
Todd, did you have a quick comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind the chair to consider doing roll call before we get too far along.
Thank you for that reminder. Let's do that. May we have the roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Bidu?
Present.
Commissioner Havner?
Present.
Commissioner Milliman?
Present.
Commissioner Petrillo? Commissioner Petrillo?
Muted, sorry, present. Excuse me.
And Commissioner Podar is absent. Commissioner Wellner?
Present, thanks.
Commissioner Will?
Present.
Vice Chair Dye?
Present.
Chair Lockwood?
Present.
Looks like we have 8 that are present.
Thank you. So, Mr. Beck.
I will continue on here. So I'll just give you a summary of some recent board actions. So on the 18th of January, the board approved Ordinance 865. And so that was the ordinance that established the urban land use designations for the land that came into the UGB by Metro in 2018 and was held up in the courts for quite a while. So that they have finally approved that. Also on the 18th, the board continued to transportation-related items that came to you previously. So 882, which was the tile flat ordinance, they've continued that to March 1st. And 883, which was the Cornelius Pass extension ordinance, that one was continued to May 3rd. Yesterday, the board approved A.N. Gross Ordinance 881. So they engrossed the ordinance to remove the 185th extension from the ordinance. So essentially, it's the same ordinance that you saw without the 185th extension. Today, as you likely know, we have a work session on the HB 2001 middle housing ordinances to prepare for the hearings on the 16th of February. Just a reminder, today is not a hearing on the ordinance. ordinances. We also have election of a new PC chair and vice chair today. Upcoming, as I just mentioned, on the 16th, which is your night meeting, we'll have hearings on 885 and 886. So anticipate that to be a long night. At least that would be my estimate. Moving forward on the 2nd of March, we anticipate that you'll continue the ordinances from the 16th. You have the right to act on them on the 16th if you want, but we, in reading the tea leaves, think that you'll probably get to the point on the 16th and want to continue them. So anticipate another hearing on the 2nd, if in fact on the 16th, that's the motion you make. So with that, I don't have anything else, but I can answer questions if you want.
Are there any questions? Commissioner Petrillo.
Yes, Mr. Beck. The January 19th Board of Commissioners meeting, that was the decision to, or were public hearings held on those two TSP ordinances?
I'm trying, there were public hearings. I'm trying to recall if it was on those dates that the public hearings were held, but I'm pretty sure that that was the case, that they had the public hearings and then continued them.
Okay, and then the March 3rd and 4th will be public hearings as well?
I think they closed the public hearings, and so it's just to deliberate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands, so thank you. I think we're ready for the next item. Next item is oral communications. Ms. Aguilar, do we have anyone signed up?
No, no one has signed up.
Okay, so let's move on to our work session.
Great. Thank you, Chair Lockwood and Planning Commissioners. I am Teresa Cherniak, Principal Community Planner. And today, the work session item we have is to lay the groundwork for the two upcoming mental housing ordinance hearings that will be at your next meeting. And you mentioned February 16th. So the idea for this work session is to talk about hearing dates and how those hearings might run. And then since the ordinance, the 885, Ordinance 885 on the Community Development Code is quite long, we wanted to give you a little bit of an overview study guide kind of presentation to help as you review that exhibit. There are a lot of repeating things, so we'll just kind of go over how that's organized. If I can go to the next slide. So I'll do a short, tiny little reminder of HB 2001 and what it is. Then we'll talk about the timeline and where we are in that process. I'll go over the draft hearing schedule and talk about how the Planning Commission hearings might run. And then, as I mentioned, do an overview of how Ordinance 885 is organized. Next slide, please. So briefly, HB 2001, we've done a series of briefings, but we do have members of the public that are listening in, and one new planning commissioner. So the House Bill 2001 was adopted by the Oregon legislature in 2019, and then there were a series of administrative rules that were adopted then by the end of 2020. So we have been working on it since then. The idea of the House Bill 2001 Middle Housing Bill was to help increase housing supply by reducing barriers to housing types that can be smaller and less costly than new detached houses. And the next slide, I'll show exactly which housing types that includes. It's really about accommodating the potential for middle housing on more lots and in greater numbers per lot by the county, since the county does allow almost all of these middle housing types in almost all of our residential districts already, but it is about allowing more in slightly more places. Middle housing was something that was fairly common earlier, and it really can provide options for people at different life stages to stay in their communities and be able to grow there. Next slide, please. So this slide, it shows the different housing types as a kind of along a continuum. The idea with middle housing is not that it's separate, but that it's kind of incorporated in with the single housing and duplex, triplex, it's all together. But to show the different types, we still are using this graphic. So the middle types, middle housing includes duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. So these are housing types that are in number of units and sometimes in size. They're between detached single-family homes and larger apartment buildings. Sometimes they're the same size as detached homes and fit quite well and look the same, and you often can't tell the difference. So these are the types that we're talking about when we talk about middle housing. Next slide, please. You've seen this graphic before as well. This is the process and timeline that we've been going through. So we started, as I mentioned, back with the DLCD rulemaking. We did an economic analysis and market feasibility study, and many of you were on the Planning Commission and heard about that. That work has folded into the development of our code concepts and the code writing. So where we are right now is we've completed the draft of the code, and we're starting through the public hearing process toward adoption. The state requirement is that the regulations be adopted by June 30th of this year. And if they're not, then we would be instituting the model code. So there is a consequence if the regulations aren't adopted by June 30th. We have had public process going on also for quite some time with our website, and we had an online open house and a survey. We've done a number of Board of Commissioners and Planning Commission briefings. We do have other outreach now going on, and we'll talk about that more at the hearing. But there is outreach happening right now to underrepresented communities, and then also to a number of stakeholders. And then now we'll go through the hearing process, and the hearing process is a public process as well. So once that starts, there will be the opportunity for people to make comments and testify at the Planning Commission. I do see Commissioner Petrillo's hand up. I don't know if you, Chair, want to take questions.
Yes, let's recognize Commissioner Petrillo.
Yes, thank you, Chair Lockwood. The question was for Teresa is you describe. I mean, we've understood and you've described the what happens if we don't adopt something by the deadline, and that it's sort of an either-or proposition. But is there also an option to adopt the let's hypothetically say we wanted to continue to work on the middle housing issues in the ordinances beyond the state deadline. Could the model ordinance be adopted and then replaced with a Washington County designed ordinance subsequent to the deadline?
That is possible. I don't, the county would not need to adopt the model code. It would just automatically be in place. So if we didn't adopt by the end of June, it would automatically go into place. And then we could, after that, adopt our own regulations that would then replace that. There are some questions right now, some discussion with the state about how that would work and what that would mean, because the model code in some ways is maybe allows some more things that a lot of jurisdictions won't be allowing. So it's there could be some implications to that the state's attorneys are looking at.
Well, keep us abreast.
Okay.
And then 2 is, what has been the public response, or what on the website or the online stuff that you've been doing to solicit, if any? I just assume this is, of course, I view as an esoteric sort of issue, and I would think that, and it's a little bit, it's pre-hearing stage, that I just would assume, maybe. Is it true that you really don't have much of a response at this time?
That is true. Yeah, we haven't gotten a lot of response. The feedback that we have been hearing, I think there's, so we did, I think we were here several months ago with the open house, the online open house results. And I think we've been hearing similar comments to what we heard there, where I think people do see that there's merit to these types of housing units, and, that it can fill needs for people at different stages in their lives. At the online open house, there were a handful of concerns about increased traffic, potentially, some concerns about affordability, some concerns about parking, those sort of things. But we have not heard a lot of response.
Thank you.
Sure.
On both points.
Sure.
Please, feel free to continue.
Okay, thanks. So next slide. So just a little orientation to the 2 ordinances and a third one. And I'll go over the schedule after this, and then Anne will talk about kind of the study guide to the ordinance 885. So there are 2 ordinances that have been submitted or filed, we call it, at this point. They will change county policy and regulations to allow development of middle housing, or to allow development of more middle housing in the urban unincorporated residential districts. So the first ordinance numerically is number 885, and that makes changes to our community development code. And those are the regulations that apply to new development that's proposed. And then ordinance 886 are changes to our comprehensive framework plan for the urban area, or the CFP. And that's the higher level policy document that sets the county policy that then is implemented through the community development code. And then there will be a third ordinance that is about middle housing, but the requirements were adopted through a different piece of legislation that was Senate Bill 458, and we've talked some about that. And those are changes to our code to allow an expedited land division for middle housing. And so that will make different changes. That's not on the same exact timeline, meaning we don't have a model code that will go into place if these aren't adopted by June 30th. But the idea is that this will go along with these other two ordinances. And as soon as we can have that completed and filed, we will, and then that will start also through a hearing process. Next slide, please. So we, at this point, have at least 3 and a possibility of a 4th Planning Commission meeting scheduled. At the first hearing, or hearings, because both of those 2 ordinances will come up on February 16th, typically we consider them in numerical order, but our suggestion is that we do the comprehensive framework plan changes first, because that is, number one, a much shorter ordinance, and number 2, it sets the overall policy framework for the community development code changes. So our idea is that one should go first, and hopefully, potentially won't take as long. And then we would go to the second ordinance, Ordinance 885, the development code changes. And our thought was, so that we don't have a meeting that goes until midnight, that we maybe focus on the oral staff report and provide an overview of the entire ordinance. We have some discussion about topics of interest for future discussion. And the PC would take public testimony to the extent that people have signed up for that. And then possibly the Planning Commission provides some feedback on what topics they would like to focus on for the next meeting. So that's the idea that we're recommending for that first hearing. Next slide, please. For the March meetings then, March 2nd and 16th are set Planning Commission dates. We are suggesting that if there is to be a 4th meeting, that the Planning Commission consider possibly having that on the 30th of March. And I'll talk a little bit about why we're recommending that. So our thought for those March meetings would be also to take public testimony and to follow up on the topics that were of interest at the first hearing, and that the Planning Commission could deliberate on specific topics, and then possibly provide some direction for your if you're thinking about any changes or if you're agreeing with the recommended approach on the specific topics. And so we would go in that kind of way where we maybe would divide it up by topic. And on March 30th, then, only if it needed, we would do the special meeting. We do expect that there will be changes to the ordinance through this process, and that would happen through engrossment. So with any ordinance that's this large and has this broad of a range, we expect through the process to make changes. So we would be tracking changes that were proposed by the Planning Commission, by community members. Staff has found some things that at this point we also would be recommending possible change to. And in some cases, the Planning Commission or staff might come up with specific language to change. Others maybe as concepts. And by the last meeting, we would be able to summarize that prior to the Planning Commission vote. And the Commission has done this there was a plan development ordinance, and we may have done this on the significant natural resource ordinance, where we then would have specific recommended changes that the PC could go through and either vote on separately or give direction on. And then that would be all folded into the final action. Next slide, please. So here are the actual dates. We did file the ordinance January 12th. We provided notice in a number of ways and had done outreach, as I mentioned. We'll talk more about that at the hearing. So first hearing February 16th, second March 2nd, March 16th, and then March 30th. The idea with suggesting March 30th is typically the Planning Commission meets every 2 weeks. In this case, there is that fifth Wednesday in March. So 2 weeks after the March 16th meeting would be March 30th. If we moved the Planning Commission meeting to that date, what it would do is provide a little bit more time between Planning Commission action potentially and the Board of Commissioners first hearing. That first hearing at the board, I'll go to the next slide, is April 19th. So that has been advertised, and we've talked several times. I think we've talked early on with the Planning Commission, and we have talked with the board about the schedule, and this is how it worked best for the board and still allowed for hearings at the Planning Commission, and then still allows us to get to engrossment, which under our process requires 2 additional hearings. So you'll see that there would be 2 hearings at the board, and then we would be filing a revised ordinance, and then there would be 2 more hearings at the board for engrossment. It would make the effective date July 7th. And so our belief is that as long as we have the ordinance adopted by the end of June, we are okay. The state has said it needs to be effective by July 1st, so we're in discussions with them on that. But this is also how the board wanted to, the board's preference, because they wanted to keep it as much as they could out of the budget hearings as well. So this was the hearing schedule that they had agreed to.
I have a question.
Sure.
So this is the schedule whether or not we end up with a 4th hearing.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so the way it works under our charter, and it may be under state law too, but at least under our charter, we have to advertise the first Planning Commission and the first board hearing at the same time. And so we make our best guess on how the hearings may go and how many hearings are needed, and kind of back up from state law requirements for adoption. And so that's how we got to this place here.
Chair Lockwood,
go ahead.
I just wanted to, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but when I think of the phrase building the airplane as it flies, this has got to be an archetypical example and a challenge that we're moving toward a deadline and trying to manage all these things at the same time, and so we'll keep our fingers crossed, but it's going to be a challenge. And then second is I'm going to probably log off and log back in, so Kurt or whomever is going to need to allow me back in. So that's it.
Great. Thank you. So if we just go to the next slide, we wanted to stop here as a place for questions, comments, or discussions about the timeline and process and that idea of a special meeting March 30th.
Commissioner Will.
Thank you, Chair Lockwood. I want to follow up on Jeff's question about failing to meet the deadline. So if we as a planning commission don't finish even with a special meeting on our 4th public hearing, then we could technically be the cause of failing to make a decision, failing to allow the board to make a decision, or will the board proceed without us finishing? And on a similar note, if we want significant changes in the 4th meeting, will that trigger the board to slow down and fail to meet their goal line? Or what will the impacts of us suggesting many changes be?
It looked like Andy wanted to handle that, so go ahead, Andy.
Well, first you should know the board's first meeting is scheduled, and we have to hold that hearing. So we're obligated to do that. And we've previously been told by them that they want to meet the deadline ultimately, by the end of June. So they don't need to wait for the Planning Commission. We have had times where there's an overlap that the board has started hearings and the Planning Commission continues. It's certainly not preferable, and I think it's confusing for everyone involved, but it can happen. So I don't know if that answers all your questions. I like to use the term like calling an audible in football. You get to the line of the scrimmage and you kind of figure out where you're at that point in time. So it could be, it could be a situation where staff will likely recommend you make a decision, but if the Planning Commission thinks they need to move on and you're not ready, you'll have to know that there's a downside to doing that. So we certainly are encouraging you to make a decision before the board starts. I don't know if Teresa, you want to add anything?
This is part of why I mentioned that with the changes, there may be some that we develop specific language for, and some that are just the concept, so that could be something if the exact language isn't worked out, but the Planning Commission has an idea that we would like you to change this thing to not require that process. That you could give that kind of direction. We wouldn't have the specific language, but what we would do between the Planning Commission and the board is develop that specific language. So there may be ways to hasten the decision without having everything all tied up by the time of the last Planning Commission meeting.
Commissioner Wellner.
Thank you, Chair. Kind of an extension of Commissioner Will's question. I know the city of Beaverton is planning on having an interim period where they have the model code in place, and that they're going to follow up with their own housing because they were working on a housing code project already. They're going to follow up with the adoption of their housing code, which includes middle housing, shortly thereafter, probably a month or two after. Can you give us a little more feedback on what the downside is of doing that? You suggested there might be, and I'm just not understanding what it would be.
Well, as Andy noted, the board has indicated they would like to meet the state deadline, so that's what we're moving toward. The model code, some of the things that we are proposing are from the model code. A number of them aren't. They're things that work actually with our code, how our code is developed. And so to have to implement a completely different set of regulations for a short period of time until you have your own regulations is a challenge for current planning staff. And so that's less than an ideal situation. So for the start of it, it would be preferable to have the regulations in place from the start. There was a question that was posed to the state about, you may know about Measure 56, and if there are certain regulations that allow some things to happen under the model code that then wouldn't allow them to happen under the county's regulations, would that be a claim under Measure 56? And so that question is a kind of a strange technical question, and we don't have the state's answer to that yet.
Thank you. I do have a couple more things, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
I appreciate the shift of the two ordinances, and when we're hearing them, I do think it's important. I know we haven't always done it, but I think it's important that you consider the policy issues first before you go into the code. It honestly would have been nice for us to be considering the policy issues months ago and then develop the code once that work was done. But I get that maybe the schedule didn't allow for that. It's communicated this before. I think this to me is the most important thing I've done as a planning commissioner in 10 years. It's a huge shift in the way all planning organizations do business. We're doing it because the system's broken. We need to do a lot more to get more housing on the ground to create a balance in supply and demand, and it's important we do it the right way. So I understand the board's desire to get it done by June 30th, but it's that big of an issue where if issues come up within, we're going to need to make the time to iron them out. I don't think it's fair or right to do it after the fact. I think it's important that we do it right the first time. So my 2 cents.
Any other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you. So I'll turn it over to Ann Kelly on this second section.
Thank you, Teresa. Hello, everybody. I'm Ann Kelly, Senior Planner with Long Range Planning. And I am just going to go through a quick study guide, something like what you would have received in your packet as far as how to approach the draft exhibit that contains our proposed draft standards for middle housing, as well as some changes for how we currently treat single detached homes and duplexes. So I'm just going to quickly reiterate that we don't plan on deliberations today, that we just want to wait for that until we have an actual public hearing. Let's see, I probably should also say, in hearing all of your discussions just now, we do understand that this is not a perfect ordinance as of yet. And at the outset, the state even acknowledged that it's going to take years for jurisdictions to refine their standards as we look to implement all of this very new policy. However, that's why we have built-in room for engrossment and further refinement over this season, and probably will need to do so in the future as well after this is adopted. So to begin, we are proposing changes throughout the CDC. You'll notice in your study guide table, that often they're repetitive from district to district. They're very much similar with some nuances. So understanding that, it may be easier to go through what looks like a very large packet with more ease, and it should not be quite as challenging as it looks on the surface. We do want to provide just an overall guide on how to look at the exhibit, focus on the organization, not get into terribly substantive discussion. And those things will begin next hearing or next meeting when we do have a hearing. Next slide, please. So to begin, Article 1 is our definition section. Everything in it starts with the number 1. In that, we have added definitions relating to middle housing, and we've also reorganized and updated some other existing definitions, either for clarity and objectivity, or just in order of where they should be in our code. Moving beyond that, and I guess I would say too, like as you move through review of the ordinance, you might want to continue to refer back to the definitions if you get hung up on anything. Next, we have land use district standards. Those are all in Article 3. They're in the land use district standards. The code covers uses that are allowed in each district and what characteristics make something a type 1 review, which is our simplest, versus a type 2, which is a little more discretionary, or type 3, which is quite discretionary or can be. So our district standards cover middle housing types as allowed uses in each district, as well as the types that they can be reviewed under. In most cases, or in all cases, actually, we're offering our simplest review process as well as an alternative that's a little bit more discretionary. I guess we are, let's see. Oh, also the district standards cover things like minimum dimensions for each of the middle housing types. Next slide, please. Section 408 is beginning with Article 4. Section 408 is a section related to neighborhood circulation. It is not a section, or actually I should say it covers things like addressing large block sizes and large block perimeters, and how with certain developments like subdivisions, we look to break those up with requirements for a public through street or a minimum a public bike or pedestrian access way. House Bill 2001 is pretty limited in what we can require, and it does not cover this sort of thing. It does let us require things for middle housing that we require for a single detached dwelling. However, we do not apply this Section 408 to a single detached dwelling unless, of course, it's part of a subdivision or partition. So we can't really apply it to middle housing. Moving on, grading and drainage applies to every type of development in Washington County. We will be applying that requirement. And we're requiring Clean Water Services confirmation that there will be adequate storm water or storm sewer for middle housing, and that will need to be determined prior to submission of an application or determination of the application is complete. The bill does allow us to require that, or requires us to require that. And then moving on, Section 413 in Article 4 covers parking. The law does limit us to requiring 1 parking space per middle housing unit. Applicants and developers can always provide more if they want to, but we can only require 1 per unit. And the proposal or the proposed standards also exempt middle housing from on-street parking. That is also not covered under state provisions. Sections 421 and 422 of Article 4 relate to floodplains and significant natural resource areas. The rules for middle housing do allow us to regulate middle housing a bit differently in these areas, and we do propose to. So we will be allowing duplexes only in terms of middle housing types within these areas and not the other middle housing types as the standards are drafted now. Next slide, please. So moving on to Section 430, which is a very large section of the existing Community Development Code. It's called our special use section. And we just talked about Article 3, which is land use districts, and you'll see the uses that are allowed there. Many of those then refer you to Section 430 and a specific subsection there to get more fine-grained development requirements for the use. So Section 430 will be amended with respect to single detached dwellings. We are adding some design standards. Actually, we're updating design standards for single detached dwellings. We did have some that are a little bit antiquated. And we are largely doing so because we can use those design standards for middle housing duplexes. So those will be applied to the middle housing duplexes as well. We are also updating plan criteria there that currently apply to a single detached dwelling when it's on a very large lot, a lot that by density standards could accommodate more than one house, but maybe somebody's only proposing one right now. We do that to protect future development potential of these lots. And so we want to do the same thing for middle housing. So we are including in section 430-37, some plan criteria that apply when someone's proposing middle housing, but it wouldn't even meet the density that's required for other types of housing. And again, it's not requiring that middle housing be built to a minimum density. It's just this feasibility plan to show that they're not precluding it in the future. And then moving on to section 430-84, that's a new section that we're proposing, and that's all about middle housing. So we are adding middle housing as a new use. And of course, we do already allow housing types that are like middle housing. We allow duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses in all of our residential districts right now. And we allow cottage clusters in 3 of them. So it's not going to be a huge difference for us to be, we won't be, adding an all new use or all new uses to our code. What's different for us is that we won't have the same density standards. So there will be a lot more middle housing that's possible in quantity. So under the middle housing standards, we are adding this new use called middle housing. And the section does provide standards for general standards for citing middle housing, prerequisites and so forth. And also design criteria, most of which come from model code. We are not applying all of the requirements of the model code. Some of them are pretty fine-grained. Some of them that we did include may seem that way to you, but there are a number of others in model code that we are not applying. They did not seem, or we didn't feel we needed to be quite as prescriptive. So moving on, section 431 is a kind of an odd CDC section. We have in Article 3 a section related to transit-oriented development, and that's all of the districts in our transit-oriented areas. But 431 is a counterpart to 375, and it contains design standards and design principles that apply in transit-oriented areas. And they're somewhat, they're actually quite prescriptive, and they're not always clear and objective. And they're not very well, if at all, supported by the middle housing bill. So we are instead excluding middle housing from most of those requirements, and just instead applying the design criteria that we've suggested under 430-84, the middle housing section. Some exceptions are that there are some very slight opportunities to provide for widened sidewalks and kind of more specific road frontage improvements to a very limited degree within transit-oriented districts for middle housing. Very, very limited. Next slide, please. All righty, now section 501. This one might be more of a doozy than some of the others. Article 5 covers public facility and service requirements, and that includes roads, parks, all of the improvements related to those things. And we likely would not be adjusting this stuff a great deal if we weren't also trying to amend standards for single detached dwellings in order to require certain things for middle housing. We are limited in what we can require for a single detached home because of, as we've discussed before, the nexus and proportionality between one house and a whole bunch of street improvements. So we're just looking at requiring sidewalks and right-of-way in order to require it for certain middle housing. Article 5 also includes the sidewalk standards, and what I just discussed addresses that as well. And then moving on, general changes throughout the code. Some of those include just removing the term family from the way that we describe different housing types. The term single family and multifamily has a somewhat discriminatory history in terms of who can live in a dwelling, and it has been an issue at times, not necessarily in the county, but across the country. We are looking to clarify where requirements do or do not apply to single detached homes and to middle housing throughout the code as well. Next slide, please. So with that, if there are any questions about how the CDC is organized or how the proposed changes are organized, how you might best review those without getting too deep into substantive conversation, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Kelly. Commissioner Wellner.
Thanks, Ann. I think it would be helpful. I know it would be helpful for me to have two bullet lists. One would be where there are differences between the staff proposed language and the model code. And the other would be what's being changed for single family housing in order to accommodate more requirements for middle housing.
Okay. Good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see Mr. Commissioner Will has his hand up. Excuse me. Go ahead.
I think that you mentioned how the changes are kind of a template and they repeat themselves. I'm not sure where the first instance of this occurs, but there is a table which shows the different housing types and the density requirement and the minimum number of units, minimum and maximum. I would love some clarification about the maximums. Like for duplex, it says 2 per parent lot, and then both the triplex and quadplex is 4 per parent lot. So if we could maybe discuss where does the maximum come from, and what just raised my confusion is that a triplex has a maximum of 4.
Yes, so we are addressing that in the staff report and all of that. The limits do come from model code, but we're describing more detail about how that applies within the staff report. Oh, and the repetition factor. Sorry, what?
I was going to do a follow-up question. Besides the fact that a triplex can have a maximum of 4 dwelling units, which is 3 plex and 4 units, that confused me. Oh. But also, it also confuses me if a parent lot has an existing ADU, and then the primary dwelling unit is remodeled or converted into a middle housing structure with 2 units. So that's now a duplex, but is the ADU count towards this maximum, or the ADU is not included in this column? That's another reason why I need some clarification.
Okay. So the staff report will discuss that. I'm going to backtrack real quickly because you brought up another question previously as well. The repetition is all in Article 3. So from district to district, you will see repetition. The maximum number of units includes any home that exists on the property, any unit that exists, and any units that will be added. So, for example, if you already have a single detached house and an ADU, you won't be able to do, and you want to do a duplex, you can't. Of course, you could do a triplex and add another unit, but you'd have to figure out how to convert your existing home to a triplex. And I think that in section 430-84, there is a significant amount of, maybe not significant, but there is detail on what happens when you have an ADU. The state does provide that if you have an ADU and a single detached home, you do have to stay, or we can require people to stay. I want my ADU to be considered a duplex unit, or I want my ADU to just be an ADU. And so we've taken...
I'm going to ask that we stop that discussion, though, because that is a substantive thing. I think it's good for us to know what things you're interested in. And I think it's good to point planning commissioners to places. So like Ann was saying, a lot of that is addressed in 430-84 about ADUs. So that would be a place to look for that. And then we can be sure to include it in our staff report, either for next meeting or for a follow-up meeting. And the Article 3 is all of the land use district standards, so 302, 303, 304. So each of those, just a little bit more detail. So 302 is like for R5, residential, 5 units per acre, which doesn't apply to middle housing, but 303 is R6, 304 is R9, 305 is R15. So each of those districts, the same things essentially repeat as far as the standards and requirements and that sort of thing. So pages 11 to 98, I think once you get through the first, section 302 is pretty much the same for each of those others, and slight differences, little nuances as it gets higher density, but you'll get the main picture by looking at one of them. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Teresa. Hopefully I answered enough of your questions for the time being, Commissioner Will. Thank you.
Commissioner Wellner.
Just to follow up, because you guys are already talking about it, the fact that it was repetitious between all the zoning districts, and obviously we've got a lot of zoning districts. What popped into my mind was, why didn't we just put it back into the 430s and reference it as an allowed use within each one of the zoning districts? It seems like it would be a lot cleaner. Were the differences that, even though they were small, were they that substantial that it would be hard to do that? Rather than just saying the same thing over and over and over and over again?
I don't know how deep to go down the rabbit hole, but you're really used to using the code, Commissioner Wellner, and other people are not. So where one person is only going to look at section 302, you know what all of the other land use district information is going to be, but they're not necessarily going to go looking at all the other sections. So for most people, it won't be repetitious in terms of using it for, a mom and pop application or something. And we did look at various places to put it, and we may look at that further, but the district standards right now do address each allowed use and what qualifies it as a type 1 or a type 2. So in terms of current format, that's where it should be, but that's not necessarily where it has to remain.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily advocating one way or another. It's more so for efficiency. I mean, the code book's already this thick, and we're making it quite a bit thicker. And I don't think it's all that confusing if under the allowed uses for a type 1 or a type 2, it says C430-84, because then you just go there. It was just a thought. And I did recognize the differences. In particular, there's maximum lot size differences within each one that would then trigger whether you go to do a type 1 or a type 2. I saw that. It seemed like if you housed everything within a middle code section, rather than having bits and pieces of it scattered through each zoning district, it would result in a less dense code. We might not have the ability to do that right now, but that was at least my thought when I was reading the 172 pages of stuff. So
we do have some interest also in potentially putting some of the information, displaying it in a table rather than all text. And we haven't done that a lot yet in the code, but that is something that we've talked about shifting away from how we do it, because we could probably put a lot of information in a more concise table. So that is something we're still thinking about as well.
There were also a couple spots which I'll identify for you before our next hearing, but parking was an example where you referred to the parking spaces as each individual unit. Like you could have just said each unit gets a space in a single sentence, and instead you listed it all out, and it ended up being a half page worth of text. It just overcomplicated it, I thought.
And County Council, would you go ahead, please?
Sure. So I just wanted to let the planning commissioners know that this is a work session. This is not about adjusting any of the language at this point because it's been advertised as a work session. So the whole point of advertising as a work session is when people see these notices, they're like, oh, they're just going to be discussing, sort of the staff's going to be discussing what is coming up in another meeting. It's not about talking about substantive changes. That's when a public hearing is noticed. And so I just want the planning commissioners just be aware of, when they start tending towards substantive suggestions, to maybe save that for the actual public hearing. Thank you.
Commissioner Petrillo.
Yes, I am here. So just to remind people, I disagree with it, as much as it may be correct from the county council's perspective. I don't want us to be inhibited with our work, either during the work session or in public hearing deliberations, by not raising issues that might be interpreted by county council as substantive. And because we've discussed what the challenge is here with the timeline, the magnitude of the changes, the multiple effects it will have across different areas of the code, and the practical implications. And we could just sit here and listen. But I don't think that then I view that our role is not just to listen, it's to raise issues as we listen and to provide feedback even. And so I'm feeling a little bit constrained by that, by council's advice. And I'm just pushing back a little bit on that, and to say that there's a need here for some of this type of conversation. We're not writing the ordinance. We're not suggesting engrossments. We're not making motions. We're deliberating the very nature of what's proposed. And we don't have enough time to wait for public hearing time when there's so many issues that may need to be addressed. So I'm finding that a bit confounding.
Council, want to go ahead?
Yes. So in response, Commissioner Petrillo, I know it's not a clear line. So there is some leeway, but what I want to make sure is that we don't start into a sort of like down the rabbit hole and then it just morphs into a public meeting, which should be a public meeting. So every commissioner is charged with sort of understanding or regulating themselves. I'm completely comfortable with that, but I just don't want this work session to turn into a public meeting.
And I might just add, I think from staff's perspective, it's helpful if there are specific things that as planning commissioners are looking at the ordinance language, you're finding confusing or you're finding you'd particularly like to know more about. It's good for us to know that. And then we can address that in our first staff report for the hearing. So that's kind of where we're thinking to not get into a back and forth discussion about the pros and cons of things today, but for us to know what it is you're interested in, concerned about, to the extent that you have something now, so that we know to get that into our staff reports and discussion when the hearings start.
So I had a question following up on Commissioner Wellner's comment about pulling out the parts that relate specifically to the new middle housing provisions. So I'm wondering, is there going to be some kind of pamphlet or orientation for the public created that explains what the county's doing about middle housing, just all in one place? Not necessarily the code specifics, but some kind of orientation document.
Do you mean before the regulations are adopted?
No, it would be. I'm thinking afterward. Yeah.
We have talked about that as something that once the regulations are adopted, that we develop. We used to always do a brochure that we would hand out. In these ages of online, it probably would be more an online thing, but we have talked about some kind of a guide, letting people know what's allowed and how it's allowed and that sort of thing.
So yeah, so a layperson could sort of easily get into the subject. Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Are there any more comments or questions? All right, I'm not seeing any. Oh, Commissioner Petrillo.
Thank you, Chair. At a little bit higher policy level, I do think the end result will be our code will be more unwieldy, and it will not be as it will become more user unfriendly. Just the nature of what the work we're doing and the nature of the status, the nature of our code as it stands. So I just want to for staff to keep in mind something I've said over a couple of years ago, which was, and which I know is on staff's mind as well, is that eventually we'll need to streamline, codify, abridge. The code's going to need to be, the development code's going to need to be worked on to make it more manageable. And that was a work plan task at some point. I hope it remains one. And I want to just plug again the idea of using or considering using a unified development and zoning code approach, which addresses many of the concerns that are being raised about, well, it's not mentioned here, and how do you know it's here? The unified approach streamlines some of that, and everything is more unified by the very name. So, and then that's one point. The second point is, we aren't going to get, this is not going to be a perfect end result. And we have to keep that in mind. And we can't let perfection be the end, be the enemy of good here. And so we really do need to realize that, we're going to do our best effort. Staff is doing their best effort to some degree. The state is, as we attempt to implement this new legislation and this new land use. And my sense is it will be improved and amended and built upon long after our appointments. Everyone's are terminated, and people have retired. This will be worked on, and so I think the idea is building a base that is reasonable. We try to address as much as we can, and keeping in mind the spirit and the intent of the ordinance. Then that might help guide some of the work we need to do on it. So, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Back.
I was sensing a lull in the question, so maybe I'm wrong, but I just want to encourage all of you to take opportunity, through this process, if you have questions, to send an email to staff or pick up the phone and call Ann or Teresa or myself. And, this isn't the only time to get your questions answered. So just feel free to do that.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Well, thank you both for the presentations. And I think that concludes our work session. I do have a question myself, because our next item is consideration of minutes, and that's going to require voting, or at least signifying approval. So I'm wondering if our two commissioners that are probably going to be on the road, if you're going to be able to, if I say, are there any objections, will you be able to indicate that? And you're nodding yes, Commissioner Bidu. Commissioner Petrillo?
Yes, I'm nodding yes as well.
Okay, very good. All right, so let's go ahead then to the consideration of minutes, which is our next item on the agenda. So we've got 3 sets of minutes, and I'll just go through them one by one. Are there any corrections to the December 1st, 2021 minutes? All right, I'm seeing no hands up about that. So I'm going to move that we accept the December 1, 2021 minutes as submitted. Are there any objections to that? All right, seeing no objections, the minutes for December 1st, 2021 are accepted. December 15th, 2021. Are there any corrections on those minutes? I'm not seeing any. So I move we accept those minutes as submitted. Any objections? Seeing none, the minutes for December 15th, 2021 are accepted. January 5th, the minutes for January 5th. Does anyone have any corrections to offer? I don't see any hands up, so I'm going to move that we accept the January 5th, 2022 minutes as submitted. Any objections? Without objection, those are accepted as submitted. Okay. The next item on the agenda is election of new chair and vice chair. And according to the rules of procedure for the Washington County Planning Commission, each year we elect a chair and vice chair for the coming year. And the way that's done is I will call for nominations first for the chair. And after we have our nominations, we'll have a voice vote. And we'll follow a similar course for the then for the vice chair. I'll ask for nominations. We'll have a voice vote. So may I have a nominations for chair for the coming year? I see Commissioner Wellner's hand is up. Please go ahead.
If you would accept the nomination, I would nominate Chair Lockwood for this coming year.
Yes, I'm willing to serve. Is there a second?
I would happily second that.
Okay, thank you. I see your hand is up, Commissioner Petrillo.
Just a point of order. Technically, we really don't need a second. It's perfunctory if you want to do it. Nomination should be accepted, and of course, the second point is people can nominate themselves, and it doesn't require a second either.
Yeah, well, thank you for the reminder about people can nominate themselves. Council, did you want to make a comment here?
Yes. So, and I don't have a comment about people nominating themselves, but in the rules of procedure for the Planning Commission, under section 1B, it says nominations for officers shall be by oral motion, duly made and seconded. And so I do believe the motion has to be made by a first and then seconded as well, according to those rules.
Okay, thank you. Are there other nominations for chair for the coming year? All right, I'm not seeing any other nominations. So that means that we proceed to a voice vote. Oh, yes, Council?
Commissioner Petrillo's hand's still up, so
yes.
Maybe he might have a nomination.
No, I don't. I'll lower it.
Okay. No further nominations. So, Ms. Aguilar, would you call the roll, please, for this?
Yes. Commissioner Bidu?
Yes.
Commissioner Havner?
Yes.
Commissioner Milliman?
Yes.
Commissioner Petrillo?
No, yes.
Commissioner Wellner?
Yes.
Commissioner Will?
Yes.
Vice Chair Dye?
Yes.
And Chair Lockwood?
Yes, if I'm voting on myself. Well, so we had, all right. It sounds like the vote was unanimous. Thank you all very much for your confidence in me. And I'll do my best. Now, I'd like to entertain nominations for vice chair for the coming year. Commissioner Will.
I would like to nominate Commissioner Dye for vice chair, if you'll accept.
Then I would second that.
Commissioner Dye, do you accept the nomination?
I will accept.
Are there other nominations for vice chair? Commissioner, well, okay. So Ms. Aguilar, would you go ahead with the roll call vote?
Yes. Commissioner Bidu?
Yes.
Commissioner Havner?
Yes.
Commissioner Milliman?
Yes.
Commissioner Petrillo?
Yes.
Commissioner Wellner?
Yes, but Deborah, you need to not show up to one meeting this year so that he can get a shot.
Good point.
And Commissioner Will?
Yes.
Chair Lockwood?
Yes.
And Vice Chair Dye?
Yes.
So that's 8
So Commissioner,
for yes.
yes, so Vice Chair Dye is elected for the coming year. All right.
I want to thank everyone for allowing me to support Chair Lockwood again, and I appreciate your confidence in allowing me to do this one more time.
Commissioner Petrillo, your hand is up.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you for County Council. Since I don't have the rules of procedure in front of me, just for everyone's edification, if there is one nomination for the position and it's not contested, can't the vote just be by acclamation without a formal voice vote? I mean, our procedures allow for acclamation?
Well, I just read that one section 1B, so I don't see why it can't be by affirmation. But and by affirmation, you mean something that's not a roll call? Is that correct?
Correct. It would just be that there's one person nominated. There's no other person. It's not uncontested, and therefore the pronouncement is X person is voted chair or vice chair by acclamation because there is no contestant. But this is a technical point, so let's just move on. I apologize. So
that's okay. So Commissioner Petrillo, if you want to give me a call, we can discuss this because it is an interesting question.
And we did talk about it a little bit in our pre-meeting yesterday. And since the rules of procedure say oral vote, and since we're meeting remotely, it just seemed like we needed to be clear with going through.
I agree. Just keep it in mind for when we're in a physical meeting.
Yeah. Okay. We're ready for our last item on the agenda, which is Planning Commission communications. Is there anything anyone would like to bring up at this point? Commissioner Dye, Vice Chair Dye.
Thank you. I guess I am just following the conversations that are happening around the recent Intel building of their facility out in another state, and the conversations around the limited land use that we have for larger manufacturing. And so I know there's been some conversation around looking at what these land use rules will look like. And so any of those future conversations, I'm really excited to somehow be a part of. It'd be nice to make sure that we are maintaining the businesses that we do have, and they don't have to look elsewhere to expand their operations.
Any other comments or communications? All right.
Sorry, I didn't get a chance to raise my hand. If I could be recognized.
Sure, go ahead, Commissioner Petrillo.
I just wanted to mention that the housing market is not getting any better in terms of availability or affordability. December was probably one of the months of lowest inventory supply in recent history. And rents have risen both locally and nationally at rates that are far above inflation. And housing prices have continued to rise above rates of inflation and isn't likely to correct itself anytime soon. And so the work we're doing is relevant for all of that. And we just need to keep that in mind because it is a challenge for people to get into housing, whether it's rental or home ownership. And both my colleagues who are involved in the industry directly know that intimately. And I think they would agree that it is a crisis whether you're talking public policy or simply even just as a matter of business. So I hope we all keep that in mind. I have seen this personally. I walked into an open house with my daughter in Beaverton to a property that was for sale. We walked in, they said, just to let everyone know, we've got 6 offers on the table, and the price is now, I think it was $50,000 more than the list price. It was a good exercise or wake-up call for me as a planning commissioner to realize, this really has, the situation we're in is real, and it's having a lot of effects that we may not be aware of until later in the future. So thanks.
Any other communications? Oh, Vice Chair Dye, I think your hand is up.
Yeah, if I can go just one more time, I felt like it might be relevant for Black History Month to bring this up, and that when we start to talk about housing, the lack of the availability for Black Americans to become homeowners, as that rate of ownership has continued to drop and decline over the years. And we have one of the widest disparities in home ownership between Blacks and other races. And so, not to say that we are going to be doing something to fix this tomorrow. I think that it's good to know that when we start to talk about housing crises, they certainly are hitting different communities in different ways. And so, anything that we can do to create more equitable solutions so that we all have access, and all communities have access to home ownership, that would be something nice to keep in mind.
Any other communications or comments? I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to the next item is to adjourn. So I'm going to move that we adjourn our meeting, seeing that we've finished our business. Is there any objection to adjourning? Seeing none, our meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very. 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 Thank you very.